There is a particular kind of silence that only exists in the countryside, not the silence of emptiness, not the silence of loneliness, but the kind of silence that wraps around you like a warm quilt on a cold morning, the kind that smells of pine needles and damp earth and something you can only call peace. I had stood in that silence for nearly 10 minutes on the morning I first saw the cottage. My name is Eleanor. I was 63 years old, and I had just done something that every single person who loved me had called, with varying degrees of affection and alarm, completely mad. I had bought a cottage, not just any cottage. A crumbling, stubborn, beautiful little cottage tucked into the edge of a small valley in the countryside, surrounded by overgrown rose bushes that hadn't been tended to in years, with a stone chimney that leaned ever so slightly to the left, as if it were listening for something it hadn't yet heard. There was a front door painted a faded shade of blue, the kind of blue that reminded you of old postcards and forgotten summers. There was a garden that had gone wonderfully wild, and a small wooden gate at the bottom of the path that creaked when you opened it, as if the cottage itself were sighing hello. It needed work, quite a lot of work actually. The kitchen floor had seen better decades. The upstairs bathroom had a tap that dripped like a slow metronome. 2 of the bedroom windows were painted shut, and one of the kitchen cupboards would only open if you gave it a firm, some might say aggressive, nudge with your hip. But I had stood in the garden on that first morning, looked out over the rolling fields beyond the low stone wall, watched a crow settle itself on a fence post and tilt its head at me with something that looked remarkably like curiosity, and I had felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. I had felt entirely, completely, joyfully myself. You see, I had spent the better part of 40 years being someone for everyone else, a devoted wife, a patient mother, a capable daughter, in-law, a reliable neighbor, a steady colleague. I had baked casseroles for school fundraisers and attended every sporting event and every school play and every neighborhood association meeting. I had driven children to Saturday morning activities in the rain and smiled through family dinners where I felt invisible and made sure that every birthday was remembered and every holiday was perfectly organized, and I had loved doing it. I truly had, not all of it, not every single moment, but the heart of it, the love at the center of it, had been real and warm and mine. But then things change, as things always do. My husband, Gerald, had passed away 3 years before I bought the cottage. A gentle man with a loud laugh and an inability to remember where he'd left his reading glasses. We had been married for 38 years, and while I do not wish to spend too long in the shadow of grief in this story, I want you to understand that his absence had left a shape in my life. Specific, Gerald. Shaped space that I had spent 3 years quietly, carefully, tenderly learning to live around. My son, Robert, lived 40 minutes away with his wife, Diane, and their 3 children. Robert was a good man, earnest, thoughtful, occasionally oblivious in the particular way that good-hearted people sometimes are. He worried about me. He called every Sunday. He sometimes drove over unannounced with supermarket flowers and a worried expression, and I always made him tea and reassured him that I was quite all right, thank you, and yes, I was eating properly, and no, I wasn't lonely, and then he would drive back home feeling better, and I would wash the teacups and stand at the kitchen window and think about the cottage I'd seen advertised in the local paper 6 months before I finally bought it. Diane, now how does one describe Diane? She was not a villain. I want to say that clearly, and I want to say it first, because this is not that kind of story. Diane was not cruel. She was not malicious. She was not any of the things that the word difficult sometimes implies. She was simply a force of nature, a woman of magnificent confidence, boundless energy, and an absolute certainty that her way of doing things was not merely a way, it was the correct way. She organized family gatherings the way a general organizes military campaigns. She had opinions about the right way to fold towels and the correct temperature for serving soup and the appropriate moment at which children should transition from picture books to chapter books. She loved her family fiercely. She loved Robert. She loved her children. And in her own particular way, a way that sometimes felt more like being inspected than being embraced. I believe she even loved me. But she had never quite understood my need for quiet, my need for space, my need for the particular kind of breathing room that comes from a life that belongs, even partially, to yourself. When I told Robert I was buying the cottage, he was surprised but supportive. He hugged me and said it sounded wonderful and that he couldn't wait to see it. When Diane found out, she said, and I remember the exact words because I wrote them in my journal that evening, "Elinor, that is terribly far from everything, who will look after you." I had smiled at her and said, "I will, dear. That's rather the point." And so on a soft Tuesday morning in early September, with a set of iron keys in my hand and a heart full of quiet excitement, I had stood in the garden of my new cottage and breathed in the silence, and felt for the first time in 3 years that I knew exactly where I was supposed to be. I spent the first 2 weeks settling in. I had arranged for some basic repairs, the kitchen floor, the dripping tap, the painted, shut windows, and I had spent the rest of my time slowly, lovingly making the space my own. I bought a second-hand armchair from a shop in the village, a deep green velvet thing with slightly worn arms and the most comfortable cushion I'd ever sat in. I filled the bookshelf in the sitting room with books I'd been meaning to reread for years. I planted lavender along the garden path. I found a local bakery that made proper sourdough and a farm shop that sold eggs with deep orange yolks and a little cafe in the village run by a woman named Margaret, who called everyone Love, and made tea so strong it practically stood up on its own. I was happy. I was deeply, quietly, profoundly happy. And then, on a bright Thursday morning, exactly 17 days after I'd moved in, my phone rang. The phone call I was in the garden when it rang. I was on my knees by the rose bushes, wearing my old gardening gloves, and talking quietly to a stubborn weed, when my phone buzzed on the stone wall where I'd set it down. The name on the screen was Diane. I pulled off one glove, pressed the phone to my ear, and said, "Good morning, Diane, Elinor." Her voice was bright, commanding, the particular voice she used when she had already decided something, and was in the process of informing you of it. "I'm so glad I caught you. I wanted to let you know we're coming to visit." "How lovely," I said, and I meant it. I did. "When were you thinking?" There was the briefest of pauses, the kind that, if you'd lived alongside Diane for 20 years as I had, you learned to notice. "Today," she said, "we'll be there in about 2 hours, just finishing up packing now." I sat back on my heels. "Oh," I said, "how wonderful, how many of you, well," she said, and I heard the slight acceleration in her voice, The particular momentum of someone delivering news they know is significant but have chosen to present as perfectly ordinary. It's Robert and me and the children, of course, and I thought, since we were coming such a long way, it would be nice to make a proper occasion of it. So I've also invited my parents, and my sister Claire with her husband and their 4 children, and my brother Marcus with his partner, and a couple of my cousins who have been wanting to meet you properly for simply ages. I looked at the rose bush. The rose bush seemed to look back at me. That's quite a group. I said carefully, 23 in total. Well, 20 if you don't count the little ones, and I think one of Marcus's cousins might bring a friend, so perhaps 23, 24. She said it the way you might say, we're bringing a fruit cake. Eleanor, we're so excited to see the cottage. I've been telling everyone about it, and obviously we'll need rooms sorted. You do have enough rooms, yes. We can double up the children, that's no trouble. And for meals, we were thinking, well, you're such a wonderful cook, and I know you love having people. So we thought it might be lovely if you handled the cooking while we're there. Traditional home cooking, nothing complicated. We brought some extra sleeping bags just in case. She took a breath. Oh, and we're staying 2 weeks. I've already taken the time off work. The children are so looking forward to countryside air. There was a silence. I was very still. The crow from yesterday had returned to his fence post. He watched me with that same tilted head expression. Eleanor. Diane's voice had a slight note of uncertainty in it, the first time I'd ever heard that particular note from her. Are you there? I'm here, I said. Is that all right? And here is where I have to be honest with you, because this story deserves honesty at every turn. In that moment, sitting in the garden of my new cottage with soil on my gloves and my heart that had been so peacefully, so carefully settling into its new home, in that moment I felt something move through me that was quite complicated. There was, yes, a flash of something that might be called frustration, or even, if I'm being very honest, a ripple of something close to panic, because I had bought this cottage for a reason. I had made this quiet life for a reason. And 3 people, 2 weeks, cook for all, prepare rooms, that was not the quiet life I had so tenderly, so deliberately constructed for myself. But then something else happened, something I hadn't expected. I smiled, not a polite smile, not a resigned smile. Not the smile I used to wear at family gatherings when I was running on 4 hours of sleep and a cold cup of tea and the distant memory of my own personality. I smiled a real smile, because in that moment I understood something. I understood that I had a choice. Not the choice Diane thought she was offering me, which was essentially no choice at all, but a real choice. A deliberate, intentional, Eleanor-shaped choice about exactly how this was going to go. I was 63 years old. I had buried my husband. I had raised a son. I had spent 4 decades being everything for everyone. And I had spent the last 17 days learning, very slowly and very beautifully, that I still had a self, a rich, capable, creative, sturdy self that was entirely my own. And that self had an idea. Diane, I said, and my voice was warm, genuinely warm. That sounds wonderful. I'll see you all in 2 hours. Tee-hee plan. I put down the phone. I stood up from the garden. I brushed the soil from my knees. I walked into the cottage, set the kettle on, and sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a notebook. And I made a plan. Now, before I tell you what the plan was, I want to tell you something important. The plan was not revenge. Let me be very clear about that. I am not a person who deals in revenge, and this is not that kind of story. The plan was not spiteful or small, or designed to make Diane feel foolish or embarrassed. The plan was something else entirely. The plan was an education. A gentle, loving, deeply satisfying education. For all of us, including me. Because here is what I had realized, sitting in my garden with my phone in my hand. Diane had never been taught to consider what it costs another person to say yes, not because she was unkind, but because, in her experience, when you loved people, you showed up for them, loudly, fully, without reservation. And when people showed up for you, they did so wholeheartedly, without complaint. She had grown up in a family where the table was always extended, and the door was always open, and inconvenience was a word that didn't really exist, because family was family, and that was that. It was, in its own way, a beautiful way to live, but it had a blind spot, a significant one. And that blind spot was that it assumed everyone in the room had the same resources, the same energy, the same space, the same desire for noise and crowds and constant togetherness. And I was going to show her, as kindly and as clearly and as lovingly as I possibly could, exactly what it looked like when one person's open door met another person's need for a quiet room. First, the rooms. The cottage had 4 bedrooms, 4 lovely, cozy bedrooms, all of which I had spent the past 2 weeks preparing with real care and attention. There were clean linens and bedside lamps and small vases of garden flowers, and enough room for a family of 4 to sleep comfortably, with a bit of creative arrangement. 3 people, however, were an entirely different proposition. I called Robert's mobile, Mum. He sounded genuinely delighted. "Has Diane rung you? Isn't it exciting?" "It is, love," I said. "Now I need to talk to you about something practical. The cottage has 4 bedrooms. You, Diane, and the 3 children can absolutely have 2 of those rooms. The other 2 rooms I will need to keep available, so the rest of Diane's family will need to make other arrangements." There was a pause. "Other arrangements? There's a very lovely bed and breakfast in the village," I said. "Margaret, that's the woman who runs the cafe, she recommended it. It's warm and comfortable and about a 7. Minute drive away. I'm happy to give Diane the number." "Oh," Robert said. "Right, I see, Mum. Do you want me to? Wonderful," I said cheerfully. "See you in 2 hours, darling. Second, the cooking. I am, as Diane had correctly noted, a wonderful cook. I have always loved to cook. It is one of my great pleasures, the smell of onions softening in a pan, the way bread dough feels under your hands, the particular satisfaction of a sauce that has been coaxing and reducing for a long time and has finally perfectly arrived, but cooking for 3 people 3 times a day for 2 weeks, that was not cooking. That was catering, and I was not a caterer. I rang the farm shop in the village. "Good morning," I said. "I wonder if you could help me. I'm expecting some family visitors, and I was thinking of organizing a sort of communal cooking arrangement. Do you do group catering orders?" The woman at the farm shop, her name was Helen, and she was exactly the sort of person who makes a village, said that yes, they certainly did, and that she knew a woman named Judith who had recently retired from restaurant work and did rather marvelous things with large batch meals for parties and events. I called Judith. I explained the situation. Judith laughed in a way that told me she had heard this particular kind of story before. "Leave it with me, she said. Third, the activities, 20. 3 people, including children, in a 4-bedroom countryside cottage for 2 weeks. With nothing to do, they would be in the cottage, on the furniture, in the kitchen, in my armchair. In the silence that I had so carefully, so lovingly cultivated, I picked up my notebook and began making calls. By the time I heard the first car crunching on the gravel of my little lane 2 hours later, I had arranged the following: a guided nature walk for the following morning, led by a local man named Dennis, who had been walking these hills for 60 years, and could name every bird by its song, and every wildflower by its Latin name. A pottery workshop in the village hall, at 12 spaces, bookable in rotation, run by a potter named Sylvia, who had a gentle manner and remarkable patience with children. A farm visit at the working farm 2 miles away, where the children could collect eggs and meet the pigs, and if they were lucky, help bottle, feed the lamb that had been born early. A village fete that was, entirely by good fortune, happening on the upcoming Saturday. A walking map I had personally annotated with the best views, the most interesting gates, the most comfortable benches, and the location of a wild plum tree that nobody seemed to know about except me and, presumably, the birds. And finally, the most important item on the list, I had called Judith and arranged for a communal cooking evening on the 3rd night. Not me cooking for them, all of us cooking together. Judith had agreed to come and oversee it, bringing ingredients from the farm shop. The meal would be a proper, real hands, in the flower, sleeves, roll, the communal effort. I closed my notebook. I smoothed my cardigan. I walked to the front door and opened it just as the first car pulled up the lane, and I stood in the doorway of my crumbling, stubborn, beautiful little cottage with my slightly leaning chimney and my wild rose garden and my faded blue door. And I smiled. They came like a tide. Car after car pulling up along the lane, doors opening, children tumbling out, adults stretching and exclaiming, suitcases and bags, and one very large cool box being hauled from boots. Someone's dog appearing, the dog that had not been mentioned, and that I was fairly certain had not been invited, and over it all, Diane's voice, clear and carrying and absolutely in charge. Elinor, oh, Elinor, it is simply darling. Look at those roses. Look at that chimney. Does it actually lean like that, or is it my eyes? Robert, look at the chimney. Children, don't run ahead. Mum, Dad, careful on the path. Elinor, this is my sister Claire. You've spoken on the phone, and this is her husband Tim. And these are their 4, Marcus. Don't let Biscuit, that's the dog. Elinor, I'm so sorry. He's terribly well. Behaved he really is. And this is my cousin Patricia and her friend Howard. Elinor, are you well? You look wonderful. You look absolutely wonderful. Doesn't she look wonderful, Robert? I looked at the group of people filling my garden path and overflowing onto the lane. I looked at Robert, who was watching me with an expression that balanced somewhere between apology and helpless love. I looked at Diane, who had paused in her magnificent forward momentum and was now looking at me with a brightness in her eyes that I understood, suddenly and clearly, for what it truly was. She was proud to be here. She was proud to show her family this place, my place, because in her heart my belonging was her belonging. My home was an extension of her family, and there was, in that understanding, something so unexpectedly touching that I felt my carefully constructed composure soften just a little at the edges. "Welcome," I said, "all of you. Come in." What followed was the particular beautiful chaos of too many people in too small a space. The kitchen filled immediately. The children discovered the garden. Someone put the kettle on without asking, which I found, to my own surprise, rather charming. Diane's mother, a small, bright-eyed woman named Barbara, sat herself in my green velvet armchair, and said it was the most comfortable chair she'd ever sat in, and something about the way she said it made me think she might be right. Then I gathered everyone in the sitting room, a feat that required some of the adults to sit on the floor, and at least 2 of the children to peer through the banisters on the stairs, and I spoke. "I'm so happy you're all here," I said, and it was true I was. "I want to make sure everyone has a wonderful time, so I have a few things to share." I told them kindly and clearly about the rooms, about the bed and breakfast in the village, which I had already rung ahead about, and which had 4 rooms available and was absolutely charming. Diane's parents and her sister's family would be very comfortable there. I had the number ready. There was a moment of silence. Then Diane said, and I give her credit for this, "That's very sensible, Elinor. Mum, you'll love it. You'll have proper bathrooms and real beds." I said, "Which is a great deal better than sleeping bags on a sitting-room floor." "Quite right," said Barbara from my armchair. "I'm too old for sleeping bags." The tension, which had existed for approximately 90 seconds, dissolved. I then told them about the week ahead, the nature walk, the pottery, the farm, the fete, the communal cooking night. I had written it all out on a large sheet of paper, day by day, and I pinned it to the kitchen door where everyone could see it. The children clustered around the paper. One of Claire's daughters pointed at bottle, "Feed a lamb," and made a sound that I can only describe as a controlled explosion of excitement. "Are we really doing all of this?" asked Diane's brother Marcus. He was a tall, quiet man in his late 30s who had barely spoken since arriving. He had been standing slightly to one side, in that particular way of people who find large groups slightly exhausting and do not know if they're allowed to say so. I looked at him directly. "Every bit of it," I said. "And if at any point you'd rather take a book to the garden and just sit, there's a very good bench by the old plum tree. I'll show you where it is." He looked at me for a moment. "I think," he said, "that I'm going to like it here." The long, beautiful days what came next I had not entirely planned for. I had planned the logistics. I had planned the activities. I had planned, in my careful and quiet way, for the shape and structure of 2 weeks that would not flatten me into the floor. What I had not planned for was how much I would love it. Not all of it. Let me be honest, there were moments. The morning that 2 of the children got into a spectacular argument about whose wellies were whose, and the sound level in the kitchen reached something approaching aviation. The afternoon that Tim, Claire's husband, a perfectly lovely man with no spatial awareness whatsoever, reversed his car into my stone gate and knocked one of the pillars slightly crooked. The evening that Biscuit the dog discovered the compost heap and had to be bathed in my kitchen sink, which was an experience I would not recommend. There were moments, but in between the moments, in the spaces and the margins and the long evenings, something else was happening. Something I had not anticipated and could not have planned. We were getting to know each other. I mean really know each other, not the surface level knowing of family gatherings where everyone performs their role. the funny uncle, the worried mother, the polite daughter-in-law, the bemused grandmother, but the actual, underneath knowing, the kind that happens when people share meals and long walks and pottery disasters, and the particular intimacy of peeling potatoes together in a small kitchen. I learned that Diane's mother Barbara had spent 20 years nursing before she retired and still missed it. That behind her bright, efficient manner was a woman who had held 1,000 hands in moments of fear, and who found in stillness the echo of all that she had carried. I learned that Marcus, quiet slightly, to one side Marcus, was a landscape photographer who had never quite felt that anyone in his family understood why he'd chosen it. He spent an entire morning at the plum tree bench with his camera, and when I brought him a cup of tea, he showed me photographs that made me catch my breath. He had a way of seeing light that was genuinely extraordinary. I learned that Claire, Diane's sister, who I had always found rather intimidating with her brisk manner and her strong opinions, had been trying for 2 years to have a second child and was carrying a grief that she'd never spoken about in front of the larger family. She told me on the 3rd evening, sitting on the garden wall as the sun went down, because something about the quiet of the valley made it easier to say things that were hard. I held her hand and didn't say anything except that I was sorry, and that it was all right to be sad, and that she didn't have to be brisk about it here if she didn't want to. She cried a little, quietly, looking out at the fields. Then she said, "You're not what I expected, Eleanor." "What did you expect?" I asked. "Diane said you were very sweet, a bit fragile, someone who needed looking after." I looked at the fields. "Diane loves me," I said. "She sees me through the lens of that love. It's a kind lens, but it's not always an accurate one." Claire nodded slowly. "She does that with a lot of people," she said. "Loves them and then tries to manage them. It's how she shows it." "I know," I said. And I did know. I had always known. I just hadn't said it out loud to anyone before. The communal cooking evening was everything I had hoped it would be. Judith arrived at 5 o'clock with 3 large boxes of ingredients, a portable speaker playing quiet folk music, and the effortless authority of someone who had run professional kitchens and was absolutely not intimidated by 17 adults and 7 children in various states of readiness to help. She divided everyone into groups: the bread team, the soup team, the salad team, the roasting team. The children made an apple crumble with the apples from my garden tree, supervised with remarkable patience by Judith's teenage niece. What followed was 2.5 hours of noise and laughter and mild catastrophe and flour on surfaces that I tried not to think too hard about, and the deep, primal satisfaction of a kitchen full of people making food together. Marcus photographed the whole thing and said it was the best evening's work he'd done in a year. Robert appeared at my elbow at one point while I was stirring a pot of soup in half, listening to his father, and Law tell a story about a fishing trip that had clearly grown significantly in telling Mum. Robert said quietly, I'm sorry about how this started, the phone call. I should have rung you myself. I should have asked." I looked at him, my son, who looked so much like his father around the eyes. "You should have," I said. "But here you all are, and look." He looked at his children doing something magnificent and slightly dangerous with a pastry cutter, at his father-in-law read, faced with laughter at his own story, at Diane, who was up to her elbows in bread dough with her sleeves rolled up, her hair escaping its clip, her face entirely unguarded and happy. "She loves you," I said. "She just sometimes loves you at full volume without checking if you have earplugs." Robert laughed softly. "That's the most accurate description of my marriage I've ever heard. I have my moments," I said. It happened on the 9th day. The children had gone to the farm for the afternoon with Claire and Tim. Marcus was out with his camera. Barbara and her husband had taken a long nap after lunch, which they referred to as resting their eyes, in the way of people who have earned their rest entirely. Most of the extended family had gone to explore the village. The cottage was quiet. I was in the garden, sitting in the late afternoon sun, doing nothing in particular and enjoying it enormously, when I heard footsteps on the path and looked up to find Diane. She was carrying 2 cups of tea. She held one out to me. I took it. She sat down on the garden bench, the old wooden one that I'd repainted a soft white in the first week, and for a moment we both just sat there looking out at the fields. "It's beautiful here," Diane said at last. "It is." I agreed. Another silence, a comfortable one, surprisingly. "Eleanor," she said, and then stopped. Yes, she was looking at her tea. She had a particular way of holding her cup, very precisely, with both hands, as if she were afraid it might make a run for it, and I noticed that her fingers were not entirely steady. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "about the phone call, when I rang to say we were coming. Have you, I think?" She paused again. I think I was rather presumptuous. The word seemed to cost her something. Not because she didn't believe it. I could see from her face that she did. But because saying it out loud required the particular kind of courage that belongs to people who are usually very sure of themselves and are learning, slowly and painfully and genuinely, to be less sure. "You were?" I said. "Gently, but clearly, yes," she nodded. "I didn't think about what it would be like for you. I was thinking about what I wanted, what the family wanted. I was excited, and I didn't stop to think." "No," I said. "I also think," she said, and her voice was quieter now, the briskness entirely gone from it, "that I've been doing that for a long time, not just with this, with you generally. I think I've been treating you like a resource, like a fixture in our family, and I haven't stopped to think about what you actually need, or what you want, or who you are, separately from being Robert's mother and the grandmother of my children." I looked at her. In all the years I had known Diane, I had never heard her say anything like this. Not because she was dishonest, she wasn't, but because the terrain of her inner world was usually so briskly managed, so efficiently organized, that the vulnerable rooms were rarely opened. "What made you think about it?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Claire," she said, "she told me something you said, about how I love people, but sometimes love them at full volume." A small, rueful smile crossed her face. "She said it wasn't an insult. She said it was accurate." "It wasn't an insult," I confirmed. "But it should be different. Diane said, with you, I should be better." She set down her tea on the bench beside her. "When Gerald died," she said carefully, "I watched you become smaller, just quieter, lighter, like you were becoming less present somehow, and I thought the answer was to make sure you were always surrounded by people. By us, by the family. I thought that if I kept you full enough of us, you wouldn't." She stopped. "You wouldn't feel the absence," she finished softly. "Oh, Diane," I said. "I know," she said. "I know now that it doesn't work like that. I know, watching you this week, watching you in this place. You're not smaller here. You're enormous here. You're more yourself than I've ever seen you. And you've been here less than 3 weeks. She shook her head slightly. I thought I was protecting you. I think I was crowding you. I put down my own tea. I turned to look at her fully. You were trying to love me, I said, in the way you know how to love, which is fully, loudly, without half measures, but it wasn't what you needed, no. I said, but Diane, look at this week. Look at what happened. She looked at me. You brought your family here, I said. And yes, it was a great deal more than I expected, and a great deal louder than I'm used to. And I found 2 of the children in my linen cupboard on Tuesday for reasons I have still not fully established. She made a sound that was half laugh, half wince. But your family is wonderful. Barbara is extraordinary. Marcus sees the world in a way that I hadn't imagined was possible. Your sister is carrying something heavy, and she needed somewhere quiet. Put it down for a moment. And your children, our grandchildren, are going to remember this place for the rest of their lives. Diane was very still. I didn't know about Claire. She said quietly, no. I said, she needed someone who wasn't inside it, someone a little further back. Diane absorbed this. I watched something shift in her face, a careful, private rearrangement. I should have known, she said. Perhaps, I said, but sometimes the people closest to us need a little distance to be honest. That's not your failure, Diane. That's just the particular loneliness of being loved too closely. We were quiet for a while. The fields lay golden in the late afternoon. A pair of wood pigeons called to each other from the direction of the apple tree. The sound of the children's voices, distant, high, happy, drifted up from the lane where they were coming back from the farm. Elinor, Diane said at last, can I ask you something honestly? Of course. Are you happy here, really? Not fine, not managing. Actually happy? I looked at my garden. My wild roses, my leaning chimney, my crow on his fence post. Yes, I said. For the first time in a long time, I am genuinely, properly happy. Not because there's no grief, not because I don't miss Gerald every single day, but because I found a way to build a life that feels like mine, and that, I turned to look at her, that is not a small thing for any of us, at any age. Diane looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, and I think it was perhaps the most genuine thing she had ever said to me, the thing underneath all the efficient love and the full volume caring, and the 20 years of trying to manage a world that she feared would fall apart if she didn't hold it together. I want to be like you when I grow up. And I laughed. A real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and warm. You're already remarkable, I said. You just need to leave a little more silence, for yourself and for the people you love. She nodded slowly. I'm going to try, she said. Good. I said, and I meant it. The last morning, the 2 weeks ended on a Sunday, the way the best things often do, gently, with a certain golden reluctance, the whole world slightly softer than it was. The cars were packed in stages with the particular organized chaos of departure, bags dragged down the path, children tearful in that exquisite way of children who have run so hard and played so fully that the end of it breaks their hearts. Barbara pressed my hand and said she was going to talk to her daughter about coming back in the spring, just the 2 of them, for a quiet weekend. I said that sounded perfect. Marcus had printed 3 of his photographs from the week and left them on the kitchen table for me, one of the valley in morning mist, one of the children running through the garden with their arms wide, and one of Diane and me sitting on the bench in the late afternoon sun, looking out at the fields. our tea cooling beside us. We looked in the photograph like two women who understood each other. I thought that was probably about right. Robert hugged me last. He held on for a moment longer than usual. "Thank you, Mum," he said, "for all of it." "It was my pleasure," I said. "And it was. I'm going to call every week," he said. "Actually call, not just Sunday, properly. That would be lovely," I said. "But, Robert, only when you want to, not out of worry, out of wanting." He pulled back and looked at me. His father's eyes. "I do want to," he said. "Good." I said, "Then call." Diane was the last to get into the car. She had gone back into the cottage for something. She said she'd left her scarf, which was draped very obviously over the newel post at the bottom of the stairs, and which I suspect she hadn't forgotten at all. And when she came out, she stood on the path for a moment and looked at the cottage, at the roses, at the leaning chimney. "I see why you love it," she said. "I know you do," I said. She hugged me. It was a different hug to the ones she usually gave, less brisk, less purposeful, just a hug, a real one. "We'll come back," she said, "properly, with proper notice, and we'll bring our own food. You can bring biscuit," I said. "As long as he stays out of the compost," she laughed. And then she got into the car, and the car moved slowly up the lane, and I stood at my little gate, the one that creaked like a sigh, and I waved until they were gone. And then there was silence, my particular hard, one deeply loved silence. I walked back up the path slowly, trailing my fingers along the roses. I went inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at it. The table was slightly scuffed where someone had set a pot down without thinking. There were crayon marks on the bottom of the wall by the back door, very small ones, almost invisible, but they were there. There was a mug on the draining board that was not mine, evidence of people, evidence of love in all its noisy, overflowing, imperfect, magnificent ways. I put the kettle on. I took Marcus's photographs from the kitchen table and propped them on the mantelpiece in the sitting room. I sat down in my green velvet armchair. I took the book I'd been meaning to reread since March and opened it to the first page. Outside, the crow was on his fence post. The roses moved very slightly in the afternoon breeze. The valley lay golden and quiet around my small, crumbling, stubborn, beautiful cottage. And I thought about what Diane had asked me. "Are you happy, really?" Yes, I was. Not because the 2 weeks had been easy. Not because any of it had gone quite as I'd imagined. Not because I hadn't, at several points during those 14 days, retreated to the garden at 6 in the morning, just to drink my tea in peace before the house woke up. But because something had happened here that I hadn't expected and couldn't have planned. A family had come, my family, in all its complicated, loving, overlapping complexity, and they had filled my quiet cottage with everything that quiet cottages are usually built to keep out. And in doing so, they had shown me something I needed to see, that my peace was not a fragile thing. It was not something that could be dismantled by noise and children and large, cool boxes and dogs who liked compost heaps. My peace was mine. It lived inside me, in the part of me that had smiled when the phone rang instead of panicking, in the part of me that had made a plan, in the part of me that had sat on a garden bench in the late afternoon sun, and told the truth to a woman who loved me and was still learning how. My peace was not a room that I hid in. It was the ground I stood on. I stayed in the cottage. Obviously, I stayed in the cottage. I planted more lavender in October, And in November I finally got the kitchen floor completely sorted. And in December I strung small lights along the garden path, and they looked, in the early dark of winter evenings, like something from a story. Barbara and I have a standing arrangement for the first weekend in April. Just the two of us. She's going to teach me a family bread recipe that she's been making for 50 years and has never written down, and I'm going to show her where the wild plum tree is. Marcus sent me a card at Christmas with one of his photographs on the front, just the valley in winter, with a single crow on a fence post, and inside he'd written simply, "Thank you for the bench." Claire rang me in November to tell me something wonderful. She cried a little on the phone. I cried too. Diane texts me on Tuesday mornings, when she's got the house to herself for an hour before the school run. Just small things, what she's reading, what the weather is doing, something one of the children said. She texts me the way people text when they are actually thinking of you and not just managing you. It is, if I'm being entirely honest, my favorite text of the week. And Robert calls on Thursdays, not out of worry, out of wanting. My cottage has a slightly leaning chimney and a gate that creaks and a wild rose garden and a crow who visits on most mornings and a green velvet armchair and a bench by a plum tree that nobody knows about. It is exactly what I wanted it to be. It is exactly enough. And if you are ever at a place in your life where the world is loud and the demands are many and you are beginning to forget the sound of your own voice underneath all of it, I want you to know this: it is not too late to find your cottage, whatever your cottage is, whatever your quiet place, your necessary space, the room inside yourself where you are still completely and entirely you. It is not too late. And sometimes the most radical act of love, for yourself and for the people who love you, is to smile when the phone rings and make a plan and show everyone, as kindly and as clearly as you possibly can, exactly who you are. Thank you for listening.